Tom Johnson stepped onto Flight 287, scanning the cabin ahead as he walked down the aisle. The plane was already abuzz with activity as passengers stowed their bags in the overhead compartments. Navigating past a few people still standing, he softly said, "Excuse me," as he moved toward his seat a few rows back, near the emergency exit. Karen White noticed Tom the instant he boarded, observing him over the top of her magazine. His calm demeanor caught her attention, and her gaze lingered as he found his seat and settled in, briefly arranging his bag. Something about him struck her as peculiar, though she couldn't quite say why. She nervously drummed her fingers on the armrest, feigning interest in her magazine article, though she hadn't absorbed a single word. "Excuse me," Karen murmured, raising her hand as the flight attendant, Linda, walked by. Linda paused, a polite smile on her face. "Yes, ma'am. How may I assist you?" Karen glanced briefly at Tom, who was now flipping through his book. Lowering her voice, she leaned toward Linda. "That man by the emergency exit," she whispered. "Is it really safe to have someone like him sitting there?" Linda followed Karen's gaze, seeing Tom absorbed in his book. Her smile remained courteous. "I assure you, ma'am, every passenger has passed through security. Our seating arrangements follow all safety protocols." Karen's lips tightened. "It's just, with everything you hear in the news, shouldn't we be cautious?" Linda's professional smile persisted, though her eyes narrowed subtly. "If you have specific concerns, please let me know. We aim to ensure all our passengers feel secure and comfortable." Nodding, she moved on down the aisle. Karen watched Linda walk away, a flash of irritation rising within her. How could the flight attendant brush her off so easily? She shook her head and refocused on Tom, who had momentarily set his book aside to reach into his bag. Her mind raced with suspicion. What was he retrieving? What could he possibly be hiding? Meanwhile, Tom, unaware of her scrutiny, took out a bottle of medication, checked the label, then placed it back in his bag before returning to his book. A sense of calm washed over him, gradually distancing him from the stresses of his week. He didn't sense the tension building behind him. Linda, continuing her pre-flight duties, glanced at her colleague Jim when she reached the back of the plane. Leaning in, she whispered, "Keep an eye on seat 18C. The passenger in 22A seems uneasy about him." Jim nodded. "Got it? Anything specific?" Linda shrugged lightly. "Just a gut feeling, I suppose." Years of experience had taught her to recognize when trouble was brewing, though it was too early to know if this was one of those cases. Karen shifted again, her gaze glued to Tom. As the plane engines revved, signaling the impending takeoff, Tom placed his book aside and looked out the window, exuding tranquility. Karen, on the other hand, was anything but calm. Gripping the armrests, she struggled to shake the sense of unease that settled heavily in her chest. She resolved that if no one else would act, she might have to step in herself. As the plane leveled out after takeoff, the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone and detailing the flight plan. With the seatbelt sign off, passengers settled in, some opening laptops or diving into movies and books. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking in on passengers and offering refreshments. Tom reclined, gazing out the window at the clouds. The tension in his shoulders started to melt away as he reached down, unzipped his carry-on bag, and pulled out a small water bottle. Catching Karen's stare from the corner of his eye, he hesitated for a moment, then dismissed it, assuming she was merely glancing around. Karen's unease only grew as she watched Tom handle his bag so carefully. Why did he keep checking it, as if he were worried about its contents? She scanned the other passengers, but most were engrossed in their own activities, oblivious to what she perceived as a potential threat. Unable to shake her anxiety, Karen signaled for Linda once more. The flight attendant approached with a friendly smile. "Yes, ma'am? Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, maintaining a light, professional tone. Leaning in and lowering her voice, Karen muttered, "That man near the emergency exit? I've been watching him. He keeps checking his bag like he's hiding something. I really think you should investigate." Linda glanced at Tom, then returned her attention to Karen, her expression calm. "I understand your concerns, ma'am, but as I mentioned earlier, without any clear sign of trouble, we can't inspect a passenger's belongings. He hasn't caused any disturbance, and his behavior seems ordinary." Karen's face tightened. Ordinary? She scoffed. People like him. They act normal until they don't. I've seen it on the news. Are we just going to sit here, hoping there's nothing dangerous? Linda maintained her professional composure, her training kicking in. Security measures are in place, ma'am. Every passenger has gone through screening. Please try to relax and enjoy your flight. If you observe something more concrete, let us know. Karen crossed her arms, muttering under her breath. You people never take things seriously until it's too late. Linda chose not to respond, offering Karen a polite nod before moving down the aisle. Years of experience had taught her to handle these situations with caution, but something about this interaction left her uneasy. There was a steely intensity in Karen's gaze, a resolve that unsettled her. As she walked past Tom's seat, Linda cast a quick, casual glance his way. Tom, sensing the shift in attention, looked up and met her gaze. She smiled politely, and he returned the nod, the moment passing quietly. Linda couldn't shake a nagging feeling about Karen's persistence. While it wasn't her first encounter with an uneasy passenger, there was something unsettling in the way Karen continued to press. As Linda moved down the aisle, Karen's frustration grew. She scanned the faces of nearby passengers. Some had glanced over but quickly resumed their activities, seemingly unconcerned. Karen felt a surge of annoyance. How could everyone be so oblivious? Leaning toward her seat neighbor, a middle-aged woman engrossed in a magazine, Karen whispered, "Excuse me, have you noticed that man near the emergency exit? Doesn't he seem off?" The woman looked up, surprised, and cast a quick glance at Tom, who was calmly reading his book. "I'm not sure," she replied, sounding uncertain. "He looks fine to me. Is something wrong?" Karen frowned, her irritation growing at the woman's casual response. "He's been acting suspiciously since boarding, constantly checking his bag like he's hiding something. I told the flight attendant, but they don't seem to care. Isn't it safer to be cautious?" The woman gave Tom another fleeting glance and shrugged. "Maybe, but I'm sure if it were serious, the crew would handle it. It's probably nothing." She returned to her magazine, clearly disinterested. Karen clenched her jaw, frustration bubbling up. She was more certain than ever, if no one else took this seriously, she would. Her gaze remained fixed on Tom, determined to catch any suspicious movement. Unaware of Karen's intense scrutiny, Tom continued reading, occasionally taking a sip from his water bottle, absorbed in his book. The steady hum of the plane's engines provided a soothing backdrop as his mind drifted to his upcoming meeting in Los Angeles. Little did he know, just a few rows back, a growing paranoia was about to escalate. Karen's anxiety intensified with every minute. Images of recent news stories flashed through her mind, feeding her fears and quickening her pulse. She was convinced danger was looming close. Determined to stay alert, she watched Tom, ready to react at the first sign of trouble. The cabin was filled with the usual sounds of a long-haul flight. The engine's hum, pages turning, and the occasional clink of a drink cart. Most passengers were immersed in their own worlds, dozing or enjoying in-flight entertainment. Yet Karen's eyes stayed glued to Tom Johnson, her suspicion deepening with every moment. Each time he reached for his bag, her anxiety spiked. This couldn't be normal. Who checks their bag that often unless they're hiding something? Driven by her growing concern, Karen leaned over to the elderly man beside her. "Excuse me," she whispered, trying to be discreet. "That man near the emergency exit keeps checking his bag. Doesn't that seem suspicious?" The elderly man looked up from his crossword puzzle, squinting as he glanced in Tom's direction. He quickly returned to his puzzle. "I hadn't noticed anything unusual," he responded calmly. "I'm sure it's nothing." Karen's frustration mounted. How could everyone around her be so blind? Desperate for validation, she glanced around at other passengers, hoping to find someone who shared her concerns. Her gaze landed on a young woman across the aisle, who seemed to be watching Tom with mild curiosity. Leaning in, Karen spoke in a hushed tone. "Excuse me, don't you think that man by the exit seems suspicious? Like he's hiding something?" The young woman looked at Tom, then back at Karen, her expression polite but uninterested. "I don't know, he's just reading, isn't he?" Karen's patience snapped. "No, he's been acting strangely since we boarded. He keeps checking that bag as if it's hiding something dangerous. I told the flight attendant, but no one's doing anything about it." The young woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Maybe it's best to leave it to the crew. They're trained for this sort of thing, right? Karen's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from other passengers. And what if it's too late by then? What if something happens that we could have prevented? I'm not the only one who feels this way. Her voice was firm as she looked around, hoping to rally support. A few passengers turned to look at Tom, who remained oblivious, still engrossed in his book. Linda, noticing the growing number of heads turning, approached Karen's seat and leaned in, her voice low but firm. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your voice down. We don't want to disturb other passengers. What seems to be the issue?" Karen pointed toward Tom, her expression resolute. "I've been telling you, that man is acting suspiciously. He keeps checking his bag over and over. He's definitely up to something." Linda took a deep breath, maintaining her professionalism. "Ma'am, as I mentioned before, we can't interfere without concrete evidence of a threat. Please, calm down and try to enjoy your flight." Karen's voice grew louder, cutting through the background noise. "Monitoring? What does that mean? Are you just going to sit back and wait until something terrible happens? That's not good enough." A murmur spread through the cabin as passengers began exchanging concerned or irritated looks. Tom finally looked up, sensing the shift in atmosphere, and his eyes briefly met Karen's, a confused expression crossing his face. Linda knew she had to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but alarming other passengers won't help. Please lower your voice, or I'll have to involve the captain." Karen abruptly stood up, her face flushed with anger. "No, you don't understand. You're all blind. Something is wrong and I'm not going to sit here and do nothing." Her voice sliced through the relative quiet of the cabin, prompting more heads to turn as whispers started to ripple among the passengers. Linda, the flight attendant, reached out, placing a hand on Karen's arm, trying to gently guide her back to her seat. "Ma'am, please sit down. Let's talk about this calmly," Linda said, keeping her voice soft but firm. Karen shook Linda's hand off, pointing directly at Tom. "He's hiding something. I demand that his bag be searched right now." Tom's eyes widened slightly at the crowd now gathering around him. Looking back at Karen with calm composure, he gently closed his book, placing it on his lap. His voice, steady and measured, did not rise to meet her accusations. "Ma'am, I assure you, there's nothing dangerous in my bag. I'm simply trying to have a peaceful flight like everyone else," he said evenly. Karen's expression was fierce, her eyes blazing with suspicion. "A peaceful flight? Do you really expect us to believe that? What are you hiding in that bag?" She snapped, unwilling to let go of her suspicion. Linda moved between them, maintaining her professionalism. Her voice remained calm, though a trace of urgency entered her tone. "That's enough. We're not having this discussion here. Please, ma'am, take your seat. And thank you for your patience, sir." Turning to address the other passengers, she added, "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. There's no reason to be alarmed. Please return to your seats." The whispers in the cabin grew louder, and Linda realized she needed to regain control quickly before things escalated. She gestured to another flight attendant for assistance. Together, they gently but firmly guided Karen back into her seat, despite her ongoing protests, now muttered angrily under her breath. Tom stayed seated, his expression calm, though his eyes remained on Karen, who was glaring back at him with distrust. He could feel the tension in the cabin, but maintained his calm exterior. He chose not to engage, especially with so many eyes on him. Instead, he picked up his book again, flipping back to his page, his composed demeanor starkly contrasting with the growing turmoil around him. Meanwhile, Linda, now at the front of the cabin, cast a reassuring smile to the other passengers before moving to the galley to contact the captain, just in case the situation spiraled further. As she picked up the intercom phone, she glanced back at Tom, who appeared relaxed, and Karen, whose eyes still burned with suspicion. Linda sighed. It was going to be a long flight. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, but the tension was palpable. Passengers exchanged anxious glances, some whispering, while others pretended to focus on their books or screens. Karen sat in her seat, fuming, unable to understand why no one else was taking her seriously. She glanced around, catching fragments of conversation. People were discussing her. She could feel it. But it didn't matter. She knew she was right. Karen's eyes flicked back to Tom. He was reading his book calmly, seemingly unfazed by the scene she had caused. His calm demeanor only served to irritate her further. How could he sit there so nonchalantly if he wasn't hiding something? Her thoughts spun in circles. If no one else would act, she decided, she would have to take matters into her own hands. Sensing her gaze, Tom shifted slightly in his seat. He looked up briefly, catching her glare. Her narrowed eyes and set jaw conveyed a resolute suspicion. He recognized that look. The look of someone convinced they'd uncovered a threat. Someone who wouldn't back down. Sighing quietly, he turned back to his book, though he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Karen couldn't contain herself any longer. Her patience snapped as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, striding purposefully down the aisle toward Tom. The movement caught the attention of several passengers, who turned to watch as she approached. Tom looked up, sensing her approach, and placed his book down on his lap, meeting her gaze head-on. Karen's voice was loud enough for others to hear. "I want to know what's in that bag, right now," she demanded, pointing directly at him, her hand trembling with anger. Remaining calm, Tom replied, "Ma'am, there's nothing in this bag that should concern you. Please sit down, you're causing a scene." His voice was low but firm. Linda rushed down the aisle, her expression filled with concern. "Ma'am, please, you need to return to your seat," she said, placing a gentle hand on Karen's arm. "You're disturbing the other passengers." Karen shook Linda off, her focus entirely on Tom. "No, I won't sit down until he opens that bag. I know he's hiding something dangerous, and I'm not going to let this plane be in danger just because you're all too blind to see the truth." Tom exchanged a look with Linda, who was clearly struggling to keep the situation from spiraling. He could see the concern in her eyes, the fear that this could escalate even more. With his voice remaining steady, he replied, "Ma'am, my bag only contains personal items. I promise you, there's nothing here that could be considered a threat." Karen gave a short, harsh laugh. "Promises? You think we're supposed to just take your word for it? You're not fooling anyone. I've been watching you since we boarded, and you keep checking that bag like you're worried someone will see what's inside." "Well, I'm not afraid to call you out." Linda stepped in again, standing between Karen and Tom as a barrier. Her tone was resolute. "That's enough. Please, ma'am, return to your seat. If you continue to disrupt the flight, I will have to involve the captain." Most of the passengers were now watching, with some leaning into the aisle to get a better view, while others whispered to their neighbors, speculating on what might be happening. Tom remained seated, his hands resting calmly on his book. He knew that any move on his part could easily be misinterpreted and worsen the situation. Karen ignored Linda, keeping her eyes locked on Tom. "I'm not going to sit down until someone does something. If no one is going to listen, I'll make sure they know what's happening here." Her voice rose with each word, her face flushed with anger. Turning to Tom, Linda's voice took on a more pleading tone. "Sir, I'm sorry, but would you mind showing her the contents of your bag? Perhaps if she sees there's nothing to worry about, we can all go back to having a peaceful flight." Tom looked from Linda to Karen, whose determined scowl made it clear she wasn't going to relent. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Fine, if it helps keep the peace." Reaching down, he unzipped his carry-on bag and carefully pulled out a small, clear plastic case containing his medication. Holding it up for both Karen and Linda to see, he said, "This is what's in my bag. It's medication. I have a heart condition, and I need to keep this with me at all times." Relieved, Linda nodded. "There, you see? There's nothing dangerous here." She turned back to Karen. "Please, let's put this behind us and finish the flight peacefully." But Karen's face twisted with disbelief. She shook her head, stepping closer. "No, that's not it. That can't be everything. You're lying. You have to be." Tom's calm expression remained unchanged. "Ma'am, I'm not lying. This is the truth. Please, just sit down." Karen's gaze darted around, searching for support among the other passengers. "Can't you all see he's trying to trick us? This isn't right. We have to search him properly," she insisted, her voice growing more desperate. Linda stepped forward, her tone firm. "Ma'am, that's enough. Please sit down now, or I will have to take further action." Ignoring Linda, Karen reached out as if to grab Tom's bag. Before she could, Tom gently but firmly took her wrist, stopping her. His grip was firm, but his expression remained calm. "Ma'am, please, don't do this. There's no need for this kind of behavior." Karen pulled her hand back, her eyes wide with panic. "You're all in on this, aren't you? You're all covering for him." Her voice rose in hysteria as she stepped back, scanning the faces around her for support. Linda, the flight attendant, signaled for assistance from another crew member who approached quickly. "Ma'am," Linda said, her voice calm but firm, "please come with us to the back of the plane. We need to have a private discussion." Karen paused, looking around at the staring passengers, some with sympathy, others clearly annoyed. She cast one last suspicious look at Tom, still convinced of his guilt, but with no one backing her up, and the determined looks of the flight attendants, she reluctantly turned and followed them down the aisle. Her steps were slow and hesitant. As Tom watched her retreat, he could feel the other passengers' eyes on him, studying his every move. Ignoring the whispers that filled the cabin, he picked up his book, trying to focus on the words and stay composed. He had been through challenging situations before, and he knew keeping calm was essential. Linda escorted Karen to the back of the plane, glancing back at Tom and offering him a slight nod of gratitude. He returned the gesture, a silent acknowledgement of the tension they were both trying to contain. While he knew the immediate danger of escalation had subsided, he suspected the incident wasn't quite over. Nonetheless, he turned a page in his book, keeping his face a mask of calm as the plane glided smoothly through the clouds on its westward path. The atmosphere in the cabin remained tense, like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment. Although passengers had returned to their seats, many couldn't resist casting glances toward the rear of the plane where Karen had been taken. The low hum of conversation grew louder, a mix of curiosity and concern. Tom felt the weight of their stares, but he kept his attention on his book, determined not to let the tension get to him. At the back of the plane, Karen sat in a seat meant for the crew, arms crossed and cheeks flushed with anger. Linda stood beside her, attempting to reason with her in a gentle tone, though Karen's mind was set. Her voice, though low, held a sharp edge. "I'm telling you, he's lying. People like him always have some story, some excuse," she insisted, her tone full of indignation. Linda, her own voice calm and soothing, replied, "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but Mr. Johnson showed us his medication. There's no evidence he poses any danger. Please try to calm down. Right now, your behavior is causing more alarm than anything else." Karen shook her head, eyes blazing with frustration. "You don't understand. You're not seeing it. He's dangerous. I know it. If you won't do anything, then I will." Seeing that reasoning wasn't helping, Linda sighed and nodded to Jim, the other flight attendant standing by. "Ma'am," she said gently, "we need you to stay calm for the remainder of the flight. If this continues, we will have no choice but to involve law enforcement upon landing." Karen's eyes widened at this, and she leaned back, going silent for a moment before muttering, "You'll regret ignoring me." Linda decided to leave her in Jim's care and return down the aisle to check on the other passengers, ensuring they felt safe and that the tension didn't escalate further. As she approached Tom, she noticed the passengers quickly averting their gazes, pretending they hadn't been staring. Linda stopped beside him. "Mr. Johnson," she began quietly, "I apologize for the disturbance. Is there anything you need?" Tom shook his head, his voice calm. "Thank you, but no. I understand these things happen, and I appreciate how you're handling it." Linda hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, speaking softly so only he could hear. "I just want to be sure there are no misunderstandings. If you need anything at all, please let us know. We're here to ensure your comfort and safety as well as everyone else's." Tom nodded, sensing her sincerity. "Thank you. I'd like nothing more than to reach Los Angeles without any further trouble." Linda gave a slight smile before moving on to check on other passengers. Tom watched her go, then refocused on his book, though he found it difficult to concentrate. The weight of the passengers' curiosity and the whispers that trailed after Linda's interaction with Karen hung heavy in the air. He realized he had to do something to calm the rising unease. Looking around to gauge the mood, Tom took a deep breath before rising to his feet. He carefully placed his book on his seat, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his badge. Although he didn't enjoy drawing attention to himself, he knew this might be the only way to diffuse the situation. Walking down the aisle, he stopped beside Linda, his voice calm but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Excuse me," he said. "May I have everyone's attention for a moment?" The cabin fell silent as passengers turned to look at him. Holding up his badge so it was clearly visible, Tom spoke with calm authority. "My name is Detective Tom Johnson. I'm an undercover detective with the New York Police Department, currently on assignment. The medication in my bag is for a heart condition. I apologize if my behavior caused any concern, but I assure you, there's no threat here." For a moment, silence filled the cabin as passengers absorbed his words. A few people looked relieved. Others exchanged glances, nodding slowly. Tom's calm, authoritative tone seemed to reassure many. He turned back to Linda, who gave him a small nod of appreciation for his effort to ease the situation. But then Karen's voice rang out from the back of the plane, loud and full of accusation. "You're lying. This is just a cover. How do we know that badge is real? How do we know you're not smuggling something dangerous?" Tom turned to face her, his expression steady. "Ma'am, if you'd like, you're welcome to call my department to verify my identity. The number is on the back of the badge. I'm not here to cause any harm. I'm just trying to do my job and reach my destination safely." Karen's face flushed, her eyes wide with anger. "No, I don't believe you. This is all some trick, and you can't fool me." Tension rose again as Tom saw the fear and panic in Karen's eyes. He realized she was beyond reasoning, but he knew he had to keep calm and in control. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I understand you're scared, but I promise you, there's nothing to worry about. Let's try to finish this flight without further trouble. When we land, you're welcome to have the authorities verify everything." Karen shook her head, her breathing rapid, her voice quivering. No, I won't just sit here doing nothing while you—" Her voice faded as she struggled for words. Linda stepped forward, her tone firm but respectful. "Ma'am, please take your seat. We've spoken with Mr. Johnson and everything is under control. We need you to remain calm." Karen looked around, seeing the other passengers watching her. Some faces held concern, others showed disapproval. Realizing she was alone in her accusations, she slowly sank back into her seat, still shaking her head in disbelief. Karen quickly withdrew her hand, eyes wide with realization. "You're all in on this, aren't you? You're all covering for him," she exclaimed, her voice rising with desperation as she backed away. Sensing the need to de-escalate, Linda, the flight attendant, signaled to a colleague who promptly joined them. "Ma'am," Linda began calmly, "please come with us to the back of the plane for a private conversation." Karen hesitated, scanning the passengers' faces, some sympathetic, others critical. Reluctantly, she glanced back at Tom, still feeling convinced he posed a threat. Without support and faced with the firm resolve of the flight attendants, Karen reluctantly followed, her steps slow and uncertain. As she walked away, Tom noticed the curious eyes of fellow passengers upon him. He tried to refocus on his book, aiming to ignore the escalating tension around him. As Linda and her colleague escorted Karen, she glanced back at Tom and gave him a subtle nod of appreciation. He returned the gesture, both aware that they had helped diffuse the immediate tension, at least for now. The airplane moved steadily westward through the clouds, yet the atmosphere in the cabin remained thick with unease. Passengers had resumed their seats, though many continued to glance toward the back of the plane, where Karen had been led. Conversations buzzed quietly, filled with curiosity and concern. Tom kept his gaze fixed on his book, maintaining a calm facade. In the back, Karen sat in a seat designated for the crew, her arms crossed and face flushed with anger. Linda stood beside her, speaking in a calm tone as she attempted to ease Karen's anxieties. But Karen was resolute, her voice still laced with indignation. "He's lying, he has to be. People like him always have a story, always have an excuse," she insisted, her words sharp. Keeping her tone gentle, Linda replied, "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but Mr. Johnson has shown us his medication. There's no indication he's a threat. For everyone's safety, we ask that you stay calm. Your actions are causing more concern than anything else." Karen shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "You don't get it. He's dangerous. I can see it, even if you can't. If you won't do something, I will," she retorted. Realizing that reasoning with her was futile, Linda gave a subtle nod to her colleague, Jim, who was ready to assist. "Ma'am," Jim said gently, "we need to keep everyone calm. If you continue causing a disruption, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities upon landing." Karen's face grew pale, and for a moment she seemed taken aback. She slumped in her seat, muttering under her breath, "You'll regret not listening to me." Linda left Jim with Karen and returned to the main cabin, checking on passengers and offering reassurance to prevent any further escalation. As Linda approached Tom's seat, she noticed how passengers quickly diverted their eyes, pretending not to have been staring. Stopping beside him, she spoke softly. "Mr. Johnson, I apologize for the disturbance. Is there anything you need?" Tom shook his head, offering a small smile. "No, thank you. I appreciate how you're handling this," he replied calmly. Linda hesitated, then added, her tone barely above a whisper, "If you need anything, please let us know. Your comfort and safety, along with everyone else's, is our priority." Tom nodded with sincerity. "Thank you. I'd just like to reach Los Angeles without any more trouble." Linda returned a small smile and continued down the aisle, checking in on other passengers. Tom attempted to immerse himself in his book, but the cabin's tense atmosphere made it difficult. He could feel the gazes, the hushed murmurs following Linda's interaction with Karen. Tom understood he might need to address the crowd himself. After a moment's thought, he stood up, placing his book on his seat. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his badge. Although he wasn't one to reveal his profession unnecessarily, he realized it might be the only way to ease the growing anxiety. He walked down the aisle and stopped beside Linda, his voice calm yet loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Excuse me, everyone. May I have your attention for a moment?" The cabin grew quiet as passengers turned to him. Holding up his badge, Tom announced, "My name is Detective Tom Johnson, with the New York Police Department. I'm an undercover officer, and the medication in my bag is for a heart condition. I apologize if I caused any concern, but please rest assured, there is no threat here." A few moments of stunned silence followed his statement. Some passengers looked visibly relieved, while others exchanged glances of understanding. Tom's composed and authoritative demeanor seemed to comfort the crowd. He looked over at Linda, who acknowledged his gesture with a small nod of appreciation, recognizing his effort to bring calm to the tense situation. However, Karen's voice pierced the silence from the back of the plane. "You're lying. This is just a cover story. How do we know that badge is real? How do we know you're not using it for something dangerous?" she exclaimed, her voice filled with unyielding suspicion. Turning to face her, Tom kept his expression steady. "Ma'am, if you'd like, you're welcome to contact my department and verify my identity. The number is on the back of the badge. I'm just trying to reach my destination without further trouble." Karen's face flushed with anger, her eyes widening as she shook her head. "No, I don't believe you. This is all a ruse. You're not fooling me." The cabin's tension began to rise again, as Tom recognized the panic underlying her words. He knew no amount of reassurance would convince her, but he maintained his composure. In a gentle tone, he replied, "Ma'am, I understand you're frightened, but I promise there's no need for concern. Let's just complete this flight without any more distress. Upon landing, you're welcome to verify everything." Karen's breath grew heavy, her voice trembling. "No, I won't sit idly by while you—" Her words faltered, frustration evident. Linda took a firm step forward. "Ma'am, please take a seat. We've spoken with Mr. Johnson, and everything is under control. We need you to remain calm for everyone's sake." Karen glanced around, noticing the expressions of passengers watching her, some worried, others disappointed. Realizing she was alone in her belief, she slowly returned to her seat, her body tense and her head shaking in quiet defiance. Linda walked back to her station, her mind focused on maintaining the peace, knowing that things could still erupt at any moment. The plane continued its journey, carrying its passengers through the sky toward their destination, each hoping the tension would remain subdued. Karen, seated in her designated spot, fumed silently, her thoughts returning obsessively to Tom and the potential threat she was convinced he posed. But for now, her anger was kept simmering beneath the surface, ready to ignite again. Tom, meanwhile, kept a composed demeanor, aware that maintaining his calm was crucial to preserving the peace on board. As the hours passed, the flight continued smoothly, with passengers eagerly anticipating a safe landing. When the plane began its descent, the seatbelt sign chimed on with a soft ding, and Captain Harris's voice sounded through the intercom, assuring everyone of their approaching arrival in Los Angeles. The cabin stirred with movement as passengers shifted, stretched, and began packing up their items. Tom closed his book and stored it in his carry-on, making sure his medication was secured. He cast a brief glance toward the back of the plane, where Karen sat, her expression tense, watched closely by Jim. Although she'd remained silent, her rigid posture and darting eyes made it clear that her inner turmoil was far from resolved. Linda made one final pass down the aisle, ensuring passengers were buckled in for landing. She paused beside Tom's seat, offering him a reassuring smile. "Almost there," she said quietly, nodding. "Thank you for your patience." Tom returned the nod. "I'm just hoping for a smooth end to this," he replied, "but you've handled things remarkably well." She gave a small smile before continuing her walk, hoping the tension would ease upon landing. As Linda neared the back of the plane, she saw Jim signal to her. Quickening her pace, she felt a sinking feeling. When she reached him, Jim leaned in and murmured, Karen's muttering to herself, clearly agitated again, "We should be prepared in case she causes another scene." Linda looked over to Karen, who sat rigidly, eyes fixed straight ahead, her face flushed with anger. Kneeling beside her, Linda kept her tone calm and low. "Ma'am, we're about to land. I need you to stay in your seat and remain calm. We're almost there." Karen's gaze flickered to Linda, her voice a harsh whisper. "This isn't over. I'm not letting him get away with whatever he's planning. You'll see," she murmured with conviction. Linda fought off a shiver but managed a reassuring smile. "Please, just stay seated until we land. Everything will be addressed once we're on the ground." Karen didn't respond, nor did she move from her seat, but her silence was anything but calm. Linda took a deep breath and returned to her post, giving Jim a silent signal to stay vigilant. Outside, the Los Angeles skyline appeared below as the plane began its final approach. Linda hoped the landing would go without incident. When the wheels touched down, a collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the passengers, who immediately began unbuckling their seatbelts and gathering their belongings. Tom remained seated, knowing it was best to wait. He could sense a mix of relief and curiosity in the cabin as passengers prepared to disembark. The captain's voice echoed over the intercom. "Welcome to Los Angeles. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off and we are parked at the gate. Thank you for flying with us." As the plane taxied to the gate, Linda approached Tom once more, her expression one of quiet determination. "Security has been contacted and will meet us at the gate," she said softly. "That's wise," Tom replied. "Thank you for handling everything so calmly." When the plane came to a complete stop, Linda and Jim took positions near Karen, ready for any outburst. Tom waited as other passengers filed out, aware of their glances. The cabin door opened, and two uniformed security officers stepped in. Linda motioned them to the back, where Karen sat. One of the officers, tall and calm, approached Karen and spoke gently. "Ma'am, we'd like to have a word with you about the incident on this flight. Could you come with us?" Karen's eyes widened, shaking her head vehemently. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I haven't done anything wrong. It's him." She pointed at Tom in accusation. The officer remained calm. "Ma'am, we just need to ask a few questions. Please come with us, and we can sort everything out." Karen stood abruptly, voice rising. "You're all in on it. Protecting him. I'm the only one who sees what's really happening." The second officer, a woman with a steady hand, gently took Karen's arm. "Ma'am, please calm down and come with us. We'll handle everything properly." Karen resisted, her voice climbing to a shriek. "No, this is wrong. You can't do this." The officers guided her toward the exit, her protests echoing down the aisle as the remaining passengers looked on in silence, some relieved, others simply stunned. Tom stayed seated, watching as Karen was escorted off the plane. Linda returned to his side, visibly relieved. "They'll take her to a secure area for questioning," she explained quietly. "We've informed authorities so they can look into everything thoroughly." Tom nodded. "Thank you. You've been incredibly professional." She gave him a tired but grateful smile. Just doing my job. I'm glad we avoided further problems. As the last few passengers filed out, Tom gathered his things and walked toward the exit, nodding to Linda one last time before stepping off the plane. The cool air of the jet bridge met him as he entered the terminal. Ahead, he saw Karen still protesting as the security officers led her away. Her voice echoed briefly before fading out of earshot. Tom continued toward the baggage claim, feeling a slight release of tension after the long, taxing flight. Behind him, the passengers from Flight 287 streamed out, murmuring quietly. For Tom, the day's events replayed in his mind, but he felt he'd done everything he could to handle the situation well. He'd faced tougher scenarios, yet the sting of an unjust accusation lingered. As he reached baggage claim, he took a deep breath, ready to move past the events of the day. Life, after all, would move on, despite moments of conflict and misunderstanding. And as he walked toward the exit, Tom felt a renewed sense of calm, knowing he'd handled this challenge with the dignity and professionalism his role required.